G'day everyone, Alex here, and welcome to episode 147 of the Trademate Sports Betting Podcast. Today I'm joined by a man who has been on the podcast before. He's an economist, F1 gambler, and author of many books that surround both of those topics. His name is Peter Sainsbury. Welcome back to the podcast, mate.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me back on. Good to see you.
Yes, it's very good to have you back on, mate. Obviously, you can assume I'm by the title of the podcast that we've gotten Peter back on because lots has happened in the last 2 years around the Formula One betting space. We talked a little bit about Formula One last time we chatted, but it was mostly about the relationship with the stock market and betting and all that kind of stuff. So if you're interested in Peter's thoughts around those topics, really interesting conversation we had a couple of years ago. Make sure you go and check that out. I believe it was episode 45 from memory, something like that. So go back and listen to that. We talked a tiny bit about F1 towards the end of the podcast, but because I had absolutely no idea about the space back then, my questions probably weren't that great, and I probably didn't, probe Peter enough and get anything interesting out of him. But as I'm an expert on Formula One now, after watching the Netflix documentary, I can ask all the good questions. So, mate, why don't we just have a quick rehash of, what we talked about last time and just kind of, what your approach is to F1. Talk a little bit about your book, maybe what's in there. Are you modeling F1? Are you kind of maybe just making your own kind of paper tissue prices, whatever people want to call it? Just kind of a quick rehash of how you approach your betting on Formula One.
Yeah, so I've really been sort of following Formula One since as long as I can remember. So it's been a while, sort of 3 or 4 decades, and kind of investing on it probably for just over 20 years in various forms, and that's got gradually more serious over time as I've kind of developed different approaches and become more serious and kind of more sophisticated in my approach. And I think the way to think about it is there's lots of different markets within Formula One weekend. There's just to be very basic. There's everything from the practice sessions to qualifying, and then the actual race. So there's 3 distinct sections to the weekend. But within those distinct sections, there's lots of different markets that are available to bet on. Everything from the winner to podium points, who's going to win out of being paired between 2 teammates or a group bet. And what I try and do is I try and think about how the weekend is going to evolve. I look at, treat it like start from the point of view of what's the circuit, what are the characteristics of that circuit, what kind of races have evolved in that way in the past, and then that kind of gives you a benchmark to how many what different teams could perform well on a particular weekend, and then I kind of gradually iterate that process based on more recent form, and then kind of an expectation of how I expect like the weather to evolve and things like that. So it's very much lots of different approaches. There's a modeling approach for certain bets and a kind of an iterative kind of I developed a kind of a benchmark, a baseline for how I expect different drivers or teams to perform, and then that's sort of gradually iterating on that over the weekend, and that's how I kind of adjust my kind of estimated probabilities of how they're going to perform. So it's a very much a kind of a 2 sort of pronged approach.
Yeah. Okay. No, very interesting, mate. You mentioned last time on the podcast that your biggest edge was in the matchup market. So, picking between 2 drivers who's going to perform or finish higher in the race, or group betting, which is, same kind of thing, except with more people. Is that still the case, or have you found edges in other markets?
Well, I think the answer is it kind of evolves over time. So, what you tend to get is the all the attention is on the winners market, or most of the attention. That's where the prices are probably the most efficient in terms of incorporating new information. Although that doesn't always the case. And so I think what you tend to get is in those more kind of niche markets, you might only get a small number of bookmakers offering those markets. So you've got nothing to necessarily benchmark it against in terms of another provider. But I know kind of from my own database of how races have evolved, how many overtakes there's likely to be between different parts of the grid, whether those prices are realistic or not. I think, so the answer to your question, I think that is still the case. I still focus a lot of my attention on that part of the the betting market. I think the overall I think in some ways markets have become more efficient, but I also think that at various points prices are at certain times you can still see lots of inefficiencies in markets. And I think to go back to our kind of previous conversation about the similarities between sort of financial markets and betting, you tend to get markets overreact to certain news or certain events. So if a driver perhaps achieves pole position, but they weren't expected to get on pole, then the price, when the markets reopen for the winners market, it overreacts. People pile into that market and drive the price to shorter and shorter odds, and that can often be an opportunity to kind of short it, go against that market, because people have overestimated that probability.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're using a lot of numbers, like a lot of data within your, I guess like any model, using a lot of data and stuff like that. Is that all publicly sourced, or do you pay like a subscription from somewhere? Like, how do you get all your data?
Yeah, I think most of it is all publicly available. There's lots of websites that will, it's like Formula1.com, and you can get lots of data from there about how drivers have performed during the practice sessions and then during the race. But virtually all of it's publicly available. But
even the past data, like the
I think where I've increasingly found an edge is by following. There's lots of people on Twitter and elsewhere that will really go into massive detail about analysing the lap times, how the car and drivers have performed over certain sections of the track, and that kind of detailed knowledge, that insight, perhaps wasn't even available even a few years ago. You might get some article in a magazine that would detail it, but it wouldn't be available on a regular basis. So, kind of like the hive mind of Twitter has been a kind of a great sort of insight as to getting more and more detailed information.
Yeah, are there any sources out there you're willing to share? I know this is like your this is a part of your edge, but if you don't want to answer, it's completely fine.
Yeah, I mean, like just like for some of the back historical data, autosport.com, they provide access to a kind of historical database where you can get lots of data by lap. So that's probably one of the sort of my go-to sources.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So if I'm a new sports bettor looking to, or maybe just a general sports bettor, but looking to get into Formula One, maybe most people are just getting in as a hobby at the moment, recreationally, and just betting on their favorite driver. But if I wanted to take it a little bit more seriously and actually try and make some money from this long term, coming in with basically Netflix knowledge, you might want to call it, what are some of the stepping stones you would say? Like, what would your first step be in terms of potentially becoming profitable long term?
Well, I guess it's just from a basics point of view, it's the same with any sports market or any investment. Perhaps you're trying to think about a process, and stick to that process, and only bet if the the opportunities are fit in with the process that you've developed. To try not to, whenever you kind of, I know when my own experience, if I sort of, divert from that process and either overbet or bet on something that I just kind of I haven't really properly researched, then 9 times out of 10 I've kind of made a mistake and I've lost money on it. So I think it's kind of kept keeping that kind of discipline over time, and that kind of helps with a sport like, for me at least, with a sport like Formula One, is something I'm interested in, passionate about, and I've been enjoyed watching it for many years. I perhaps struggle to do that for some other sports, for example. So that's an advantage for me in having that. I think from a perspective of someone who's starting afresh, I think it's kind of watching lots of races, lots of the recent races, kind of see how races evolve. That's where you get your kind of experience about how how different drivers perform, what the likelihood of passes are actually happening, and then you can kind of look ahead to the next race as to what is just because something happened in the previous race doesn't mean it's going to happen in the race that's going to come up ahead, next one on the calendar. It's very different characteristics. And then you can always buy my book to get more insights. But perhaps we'll talk about that later. But just on that, I wrote the book just to kind of to put all my thoughts down on in words, just to kind of put it down on paper, just to help, as you say, people who are getting into the space for the first time, what are the sort of basic things they need to know about Formula One, where can they find, different markets, how would they get started? So I think it's kind of getting a basic knowledge, developing a process, and then, sticking to certain parts of the market that know about, whether it's a certain drivers at the front of the field or those further back, and then kind of working from there.
Yeah. Okay. I'd love to talk a little bit about Drive to Survive and the effect that's had on the market. But firstly, I was just a little bit off topic. I was going to ask how much the Formula One takes up your own as your profession. Like, is it 10% of what you do in terms of all your other stuff with the stock market and gold and silver, all that kind of stuff, or is it quite a big part? And are you like, would you say you're betting on this professionally? Are you working for any syndicates or anything like how big is your operation at the moment?
I'd say it's probably accounts for perhaps 20%, 25% of my kind of working life, essentially. Both in terms of the time I'm devoting to it, and the essentially the kind of how profitable it is for me. So okay, that varies season by season, but I know that by working on that process and that edge, over time it kind of works out pretty well. So no, I'm only myself, working for myself essentially. So I'm not sort of partnering with anyone else at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome, mate. So Drive to Survive. How's it affected the betting space? I think this would be really interesting because you can look at it two ways and go, there's a lot of dumb money coming through. Dumb money is probably a little bit rude, but it's people just having a bit of fun, and that could potentially affect the market in one way. Let's just say, Verstappen's basically going to be close to favorite every single race. Let's say he's like the most popular driver in the world too. I assume his prices are going to be too short most of the time. So you can look at it that way and say, the market's creating opportunities for someone like yourself, or is it actually bringing more, shrewd, smarter, sharper bettors into the market, and you're actually finding it harder or at least your edges are becoming a little bit smaller? How's it affected your betting in general?
I think well, first of all, I think it's maybe a I forget exactly when, but maybe 5 or 6 years ago, Formula One betting interest was starting to really sort of wane. I could see a noticeable deterioration in it. Certainly like the volumes on Betfair, and the number of bookmakers that were offering kind of comprehensive markets was starting to go down. The number of kind of interesting markets, just it was really hard to get bookmakers to put anything interesting up. That has changed, and I think in the last 4 or 5 years, since Drive to Survive, started. Whether the two were, there was any causality between the two, I don't know, but you can certainly see an increase interest in, from a betting perspective, on the volume basis and the type of markets. Whether that's, I'm sure it's brought some people who might have, for example, bet on, IndyCar or NASCAR that, have, started to look into Formula One as an alternative market, motor racing market. They're interested in racing cars and can see the parallels with Formula One. But I think, I think overall it's probably, you can start at certain points in the weekend. You can see those kind of inefficiencies come in. I mentioned like the sort of qualifying, after a qualifying session is closed, and then the winners markets opened up. You can see bigger inefficiencies perhaps than there was even a few years ago. So that's interesting. Whether you do get some level of recency bias between different races, but I think bookmakers and the betting exchanges, people on betting exchanges are probably becoming more efficient in terms of anticipating what's coming up ahead than they were a few years ago. So it's a bit mixed bag, really, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the opening of markets after qualifying. Would you say that potentially the biggest inefficiencies are between qualifying and the actual race, or are they more inefficient at those points than, let's just say, 3 days before qualifying or 2 days before the event has even started?
Yeah. I mean, that was just one example. I think I try and jump on any inefficiency whenever it appears. If that's a few days before, or kind of 30 seconds before the session starts, then I'll have a look. But I think I think when you really get those kind of opportunities is when there there's been a change in the process, or change in the order of the weekend. So if there's like there might have been rain during one practice session, or
right,
a couple of drivers had an accident which disrupted their program on the Friday, and that creates a kind of momentum that a driver that's perhaps performed quite well can overperform relative to the competition during qualifying in the race. And so I think it's kind of spotting those opportunities that people tend to base it on what's happened in the last, that kind of recency bias. But if you try and ignore that, and there are opportunities that come up, especially when things are volatile.
Yeah, no, certainly, mate. So I guess in to summarize, you're saying there's probably a little, or at least more inefficiencies throughout the weekend than there is maybe a couple of days beforehand, when we don't really have that much information.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the market doesn't really move very much up until after Friday practice. That's when things start to move. Especially if there's been a because this, for example, this weekend coming up, it's the Spanish Grand Prix, and it's usually quite a kind of a pivotal part of the season. All the teams are bringing their sort of major upgrades to their cars. Kind of this, it's usually the first time they're back in Europe, close to the factories, so they can bring all these new parts to their cars, and that sometimes sets the scene for the next several races. And it varies season by season. Sometimes there's absolutely no change; they just kind of move, relative to each other. They're absolutely, they stay in the same place. But other times, you do get people that jump, between, up or lower down the grid. So it's, this weekend is slightly different, and there might be, that kind of knowledge of what teams are bringing what and who isn't doing, bringing any new parts out. That can be quite valuable.
Yeah, how do you then predict who's going to be faster or potentially stay the same? Is it very difficult for someone that knows nothing about cars and someone who wouldn't know how to fix, a tire on my car if I got a puncture?
Same
if Mercedes are releasing statements or something a couple of days before the Spanish Grand Prix saying, yeah, we've got this new exhaust pipe or so. I know it's a ridiculous example, but I would say, well, great, but I have no idea if it's going to make you faster or slower.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I mean, it's just a very subjective point of view. The teams won't really know until they've put it on the car and done a few laps, and then they'll get a feel for whether it is actually better or not. So, you're making a bet as to whether that's, that those upgrades are working, and you're kind of basing that on, how have those teams performed in previous years? Do they develop their car well during the season? Because some teams, for example, like Red Bull, tend to almost get faster and faster as the season progresses. So they've tended to be very good at developing their car. But that they just kind of caveat to that, this particular year again is different. And I think just to touch on that is that, unlike perhaps many other sports, almost every year the pieces, if you like, of the game, of the sport are almost reset. Not every year, but the rules change to a little extent every year. Sometimes they have massive aerodynamic regulations that can upset the field completely, and then so you're constantly trying to judge, starting from scratch and judge how that's going to evolve.
So when it comes to the implementing new parts into a system like a lot of teams will do at the Spanish Grand Prix, are you there's potentially lots of changes coming in? Is that a weekend where you're like, I have to watch practice with a very keen eye, because this could really affect majorly how I bet from now on into the weekend?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like sometimes the Spanish Grand Prix, this what tends to happen, it doesn't necessarily make a massive difference to the rest of the season, but sometimes it can be really significant. So to that extent, and it's important from a bets for this particular weekend, but also potential sort of any sort of season bets that I have about how well the drivers or constructors championship, and other bets as well. So I do my own, I watch the practice sessions and do my own research on that. But I also follow what other people are saying about it. What magazines, at the end of the day, magazines like Autosport and others, they delve in, beneath all the numbers and try and unpick how well those upgrades have done, and who's looking happy and who's looking like there's going to be a long season ahead of them. So it's kind of picking up those little bits of information, and some of that you get in the like the interviews that they do at the end of the day. If you either it's probably better to watch the actual live interview or videos, because then you can really kind of tell whether a driver is happy about how their session's gone, and whether they're kind of looking pretty demoralized. You can't always I was gonna say, you can't always get that from kind of a PR spiel that they've had to regurgitate, whereas if you just look in their faces, you can see you get a much better feel for how well it's gone.
Well, that was one of the questions I was going to ask later. Was I have heard? Sorry, I am still here. I have heard from lots of people that the interviews that the drivers give are very insightful, and you can almost gain an edge from listening to those interviews, which is like the complete opposite of so many other sports around the world, where when a football player or any kind of especially team sports, you're not going to be able to gain much of an edge from listening to an interview. But it sounds like it's almost the complete opposite in Formula One, that they'll actually gives away some really great information that you can use in betting for that weekend.
Yeah, I mean, it does vary. Just different drivers are more talkative than others, and will give more information away. But you get insights as to whether their particular upgrade is working really well or not. How they're doing against their teammate. What for example, they might whether, if they're just before the race, if they're lining up on a different part of the grid, one side can have more grip than the other. Sometimes you don't get that kind of information from just looking at the TV or from previous years. There's so I think unlike perhaps that's in other sports, you get the drivers are interviewed 10 minutes, quarter of an hour before the race, and I think that's unheard of in many other sports. So you do there are sort of useful little bits of information you can pick up.
Yeah, no, certainly. Are the bookies good at reacting to that kind of stuff? Like, do you think they're watching interviews or, following news of anything interesting a driver might have to say before a race or after qualifying and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think it's perhaps when the coverage is on TV. So that might be like an hour or so before the race starts. Then I think you can tell that everyone's probably watching the same interview, and the markets are moving on that same news or that same opinion. Whether it's the commentators or what the drivers are saying. I think it's kind of in between sessions when the attention isn't on what's happening, or then you've got an opportunity to kind of react to an opinion or what a particular driver is saying, because they're much slower to react to that news.
Yeah, so overall, it sounds like there's a lot of moving parts throughout the whole weekend. Are you placing most of your bets at a certain point? Are you placing any bets on, say, like a Thursday or something like that before anything's happened, or are you very much making your mind up after practice, after qualifying, and all those kinds of things?
I'd say it really varies. If I don't see anything of interest, almost any part of the weekend, I sometimes I don't necessarily place any bet, or very small bets, if I don't see anything particularly that's jumping out at me. And so I'm really quite sort of selective in that kind of approach. But other times I'm if I've got a very strong conviction about something that's gonna happen, then I'm looking to get a really good price on Monday or Tuesday, right at the start of the week, before the race weekend. So it absolutely varies depending on what the opportunities are.
Yeah, and there are, I think you mentioned this at the start, there are some tracks that suit certain cars or teams. Do you think that's factored into the odds from race to race, or is it kind of the same odds, every single race? Like, it doesn't really change too much.
I think it is factored in when it comes to the drivers at the front of the grid. So like especially the winners market or the podium. I think it's the kind of midfield, towards the back where that kind of information is just not really factored in at all.
Right.
And part of that is because when you're in that kind of jumble of cars, kind of towards the back, that first few laps can make or break a particular driver's race. So there is a lot more kind of jeopardy involved, certainly on some particular tracks. So I think the odds do give that kind of, the less, they don't necessarily need to be as precise perhaps as as those drivers at the front of the grid.
Yeah, right. Is there any drivers that the market kind of just always overrates or underrates, or is it kind of changing from race to race?
It's such a difficult one because I think almost not necessarily just because from a betting perspective, but almost like people's expectations of him. Despite him being a multiple world champion, I think Lewis Hamilton expectations are always so low, and I think perhaps some people kind of are kind of wishing him to fail sometimes, and that's kind of what's reflected in their expectations of him. But I think people are very quick to write him off, and I've made a mistake in the past of thinking he's perhaps not as good as perhaps he is, and I've underestimated him in the past to my cost. And I think people, if I was going to pick anyone, I think bizarrely, I think it's probably perhaps the best driver there is people do underestimate him.
Yeah, no, that's crazy. So how do you see how the events are playing out now? I mean, you go into the pre-race odds nowadays, and he's huge odds to win a race. Do you think that's he's being underestimated, like you just mentioned, or would you say that's fair?
Well, I think it's reflecting the car as it has been certainly since the start of the year. It's been a kind of a front of the midfield car, so behind Ferrari and Red Bull, at best, really. And he's been, well, the results would say that he's been shown up by his teammate, his George Russell. But I think there's more to it underneath that he, in some ways he's been a little bit unlucky in areas on certain races, and because they've had such a bit of a kind of a diva of a car, he's had the challenge of trying to do some kind of experimental settings on his car to try and work out that sort of quirkiness. But the risk that means is sometimes his car is he's just not set up correctly, so he's taken a risk and it's not worked out. But everyone then jumps on the result and says his teammate has beaten him, and Lewis Hamilton is about to retire. And so I don't see that happening, but for the moment at least, I think he's he hasn't forgotten how to drive. None of these drivers forget how to drive. They might be going through a bad patch, so they just need something in the car to click, and they're back to their normal selves.
How difficult is it to kind of, we talked a little bit about this with bringing in new parts now that they're back in Spain, but how hard is it to predict when or if Hamilton and Mercedes are gonna reform and become the powerhouse they once were? Because it feels like you can it almost feels like a little bit of a guessing game, but is there any kind of logic you can make? Because if you pick the right weekend that he's going to come good and win the Grand Prix, you're going to get some huge odds.
Yeah, I mean, so like ahead of the last race in Miami, Mercedes were about something like 25-1 to win the constructors championship. So to to be back on form and to win that that team's championship. After the Friday sessions, it looked like Mercedes were bang on it. They'd cured every problem with their car, and that market went into about 5 or 6 to 1 just in the space of one afternoon.
Crazy.
Yeah, but then come Saturday morning, there's a practice session on Saturday ahead of the qualifying. They'd somehow completely lost all that direction that they discovered on Friday. It's obviously it's kind of on a knife edge. They were on it on Friday, and they somehow sort of slipped off. Come Saturday morning, and they couldn't get their way back onto that. So since then, I think the market went up to about back up to 25, 30 to 1. Just after that weekend. So I think they know that there's a very quick car in there, and I think everything tells you or tells me that it's a very quick car, and then they just need to unleash it, and it's going to be towards the front of the field. But what you're kind of betting on is that there's almost like a small tweak or a relatively small change that they've got to do, and then that just kind of unleashes a massive increase in performance that and increases their kind of operating window to be able to find that performance. So I think kind of going back to things about the kind of development. In previous years, they've had almost like massive budgets to be able to work through these problems. The top teams had an advantage to get more money, so they could devote more resources to kind of cure these kind of problems. But this year, because there's a cost cap, it is slightly different. So each team it's got a certain number of chips that they can effectively deal, almost like a game of poker across the season, and they need to work out, when is it best to spend those chips? Because if we spend them too early, go down some blind alleys with our development, we're just going to fall down the field while everyone else is developing their car. So it's a much more sort of strategic season this year, which is quite interesting from my perspective, and it's going to be fascinating to really see whether Mercedes get on top of it. I think they will, because they're the strongest team there, but whether it's this weekend or in a few weekends time, I'm not sure.
Yeah, because I guess if in the past they probably would have, they found a bit of speed at the beginning of Miami, and then lost it towards the end. You would think that that maybe 2 weeks after they can figure out why exactly they lost the speed and regain it. But I guess the whole salary cap or whatever it's called thing makes it a bit more interesting, because they might think that, maybe we'll just spend the money later in the season. So a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, and the real risk is that they say, we can't develop this car. We've gone down the blind alley with the concept that we've got. We almost have to ditch it, go back to square one, and then just think, we're not going to win any races or win any championships this year. Let's just develop the car for next year and hopefully get to the front of the field come the start of 2023. In which case, it's going to be a very long season for both Hamilton and Russell. But then again, that gives me an opportunity perhaps to go against Mercedes, or look at some of the other teams that could perhaps leapfrog Mercedes through the rest of the year.
Yeah, no, very interesting, mate. One approach I have thought of, that a bettor could potentially implement, and lots of bettors can kind of do this in a lot of sports where there's a lot of interest and the market's quite efficient, is kind of just benchmarking a certain bookmaker that you might believe is the most efficient, creates the most accurate odds on a sporting event or on the Formula One, and then betting any outliers or any kind of market where there's huge differences, just picking up the best price at the bookmaker that's seemed to have got the most wrong in relation to that benchmark. Is that possible in Formula One? Like, is there a bookmaker or the exchanges that are just so efficient that you can rely on their prices as, that, like, they are basically 90 times out of 100, they're very, very accurate?
I don't think there's a single bookmaker I could say that's always on top of the game and has a good read of the market. I think there are a few that are reasonably good most of the time, but I mean, what tends to happen is one bookmaker, as perhaps other sports, one puts up its prices, everyone else perhaps doesn't really necessarily know too much about the sport. They just follow what that bookmaker's done, but then they might not react to changes in the market as the week progresses. So then as you your question says, you do get opportunities where one bookmaker has just clearly not been following the market, not adjusted their prices, and you kind of do see big outliers occasionally. So it's definitely something I watch out for. Yeah,
so it's more so getting, I guess, the general price of maybe 10 or so bookmakers and seeing if there's any a potential strategy could be finding just one that's way out on what everyone else has got.
Yeah, I mean, like other sports, odds checker, is a good reference point to see how different bookmakers are kind of approaching the market, and and you do see sometimes different bookmakers clearly thought about it and have adjusted their prices, but others you can definitely see are also they're complete followers of what perhaps the main bookmaker in the market is doing. So it's about kind of not necessarily it's kind of like understanding who you're betting against, who's on the other side of the market. Like in any other market, you're not just betting on the event or the particular price of a particular financial market or the price of a sporting event occurring, but you're actually looking, who's on the other side of that trade and what do they know and why have they priced it up the way they have.
Yeah, no, definitely, mate. Matt, questions around bookmakers then. Is there any like very good bookmakers? I noticed some just here in Australia that will release 50 plus markets on an event on the weekend, which is great. Are there is there like a general, like, who offers the best odds for those, for the F1 and the most markets?
Yeah, I think in terms of sort of comprehensive market, someone like sort of Sporting Bet, and also I mean they're part of Ladbrokes and Coral. They tend to have a good massive range of markets, and importantly those markets that are kind of the more sort of niche markets towards the back of the field. So I think if I was going to choose anyone in terms of sort of sheer range of markets, it'd probably be them.
Yep. Okay, cool. And how have you found it quite hard to keep some of your accounts from, I assume maybe it's a little bit better these days because there's more people betting on it, but or we can talk about nowadays what it's like, because I guess it's more relevant than the past, but have you found it hard keeping your accounts unlimited from successful F1 betting, or is it really not that niche and you can get actually decent amounts down and not be limited too early?
I think you just got to be a little bit careful, and again, sort of know certain bookmakers are much quicker to clamp down, and depending on if you're betting a certain way. So it's about just being quite careful and not necessarily using one particular bookmaker to place a bet. If you wanted to get it down in size, so then you're kind of just making it a bit more, and then reflects not just about being restricted, but it also means that you can't. You're trying not to move the market, not to provoke too much sort of slippage in the price, or at least sometimes you're not. So that's kind of how I approach it. Really, just trying to be very sort of careful and kind of know who I'm betting against and what they're likely to do if I'm, if I get too greedy in a particular market from a particular bookmaker. So yeah, no, it's definitely been a challenge keeping accounts open, but it's just it's part of the game, and you just got to keep using different tactics to try and get ahead.
Are you using your own accounts, if you don't mind me asking, or have you kind of had to evolve and use friends and families and all the good stuff?
Yeah, exactly. A good range. I've lost count of how many accounts I've got.
Yeah, I would imagine. But back to what you were kind of saying, because I assume there's lots of followers in the market. So let's just say you really wanted to back Verstappen to win at the Spanish Grand Prix. He's basically got the same odds everywhere. So you could probably really spread your bets out across bookmakers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so if you're not trying to provoke a sort of change in the price, then being restricted, then I try and make it spread it across as many as I can. Without it being too much hassle.
Are there particular markets that they really don't accept a big bet on? Like, I assume they accept the biggest bets on, the winner of the Grand Prix, but like matchups and group betting, are they a lot more? Oh, yeah, there's certain markets where they're just like, yeah, you can have, $50 or something on.
Yeah, I think it's where, I guess it's where they've got the ability to hedge in a particular way, either on the exchanges or through perhaps through other means, other bookmakers. Then that's where I think you can probably put something on in size. I think somewhere it's where they get like the group markets are really interesting, but sometimes they're almost like unique markets. No other bookmaker has got that identical market, so there's no they're kind of a there's sometimes they allow a lot of money, sometimes not, so it's just I just have to be careful with it.
All right, cool, mate. One final question for you, and I try and ask all of my friends this question who have been following F1 for years, because I think this is the most interesting thing. It's got nothing to do with betting at all. So sorry for me building this up and anyone thinking I'm going to ask some whiz bang question, but I've always wondered if everyone was in the exact same car, they had no advantage at all. Who would? Can you give me your top 5 drivers from 1 to 5 on who, if they were all in the exact same car, who would, if you had to guess, from your opinion, who would be the top 5 drivers
of the drivers that are currently in Formula One right now? Yeah, because that question has been asked about of all time. Who would be your top 5 of all time? But I think
we can get to that one after.
Yeah, that's an even harder one perhaps. But I think there's an element of kind of the best do tend to rise to the top eventually.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
it doesn't always happen. Either luck or the lack of it, or funding. It's kind of quite a cruel sport in that respect. So the best don't always get a chance to get into Formula One, let alone get in the best team and show off their ability. But based on who's there and what they've been able to show since they've been in Formula One, then I'd still put Hamilton first. Perhaps someone like Alonso second. Verstappen third. Charles Leclerc fourth. And struggling with the fifth one.
Ricardo, mate, you got to put him in there somewhere.
Yeah, maybe. let's put Ricardo in there. Yeah.
That's what I wanted to hear, mate. And yeah, I mean, there's probably a debate there because you've got Hamilton. I think he's got the most world titles, hasn't he?
Yeah, he has. I think I mean, and that ranking was kind of based on not just like who's fastest over a single lap, but who's the kind of complete package.
Yeah.
And I'd say certainly, Hamilton and and Alonso have, they've won multiple world championships. They've got experience, but they've also got lightning speed. Despite their relative age versus some of the new guys in the sport as well. So I think on that basis, I'd put them at the front.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you say Alonso number 2 because he's not even close to being on one of the better teams. Like why wouldn't a Red Bull or a Ferrari or a Mercedes be recruiting him to be in their team if he's one of the best drivers on the grid?
Yeah, well, there's a very long and controversial set of stories to probably as to why that hasn't or isn't happening at the moment. Probably is a little bit difficult to manage as a driver, or certainly was when he was younger. So he had lots of opportunities. He's won 2 world championships. Went to Ferrari. Narrowly missed out on a championship there. Left Formula One. Had a chance to come back. That rarely happens for many drivers. Certainly of his caliber. And despite his relative age, going up against someone like Esteban Ocon in his team, who is a very good driver. He's, despite his results this year, which I think has been down to bad luck, he's performing incredibly well. So I certainly hope that the Alpine team keep him on beyond this year, because he's a kind of a real asset to Formula One.
Yeah, no, of course, mate. All right, that was awesome. Where can before we go, where can people find you? Anything interesting you've got going at the moment? Maybe you can mention your other work outside of Formula One betting. And maybe you can talk a little bit about your book too, which I think I can see behind you.
I know, conveniently placed. So I wrote it. The winning formula, betting on Formula One. It's about must have been 2 or 3 years ago now that I actually published it. There's little bits in there that are probably the sport has changed ever so slightly. So not everything is exactly necessarily the same as how some of the rules have changed a little bit, but the essence of my approach and how I look at every weekend is kind of detailed in there, to the best that I can outline it. So yes, to some of the other books I've written, my kind of other part of my day job is about kind of commodity markets. So a few going back 3 or 4 years ago, I wrote a book called Commodities 50 Things You Really Need to Know. So that was kind of to try and help investors in that market, kind of educate them, where how to think about these kind of unusual asset markets, and that's 4 or 5 years ago, commodities as an asset class were a little bit dead in the water. Today, they're the only thing that anyone's really talking about in terms of energy prices and food. The price of food going up as well, so it's especially relevant today. Check both of those books out. In terms of I was going to say, in terms of where people can find me, probably the best way is on Twitter, and that's at piece of Sainsbury 7. Yes, that's probably the best place.
Awesome, mate. It's been a pleasure having you on and learning more about the Formula One betting market. So hopefully we've helped out a few people today, especially myself, in maybe just placing a few dollars here and there. It's always fun to wake up Monday morning here and watch the highlights, because normally it's while I'm sleeping. So maybe it'll be a little bit funner if I can have a few dollars on some of the races coming up. So thanks for helping me out at least, mate.
That's been good. Thank you.
No worries. For listeners, next podcast coming out, I'm not too sure who we'll have on next, but we should have some guests coming on the next couple of weeks. Got some time to do some recording over the next couple of weeks. So that should be fun. So look out for more podcasts on the way. And thanks for listening, everyone. Make sure you do a quick rate and review of the podcast if you have time, and subscribe to us wherever you listen, whether that's on your podcasting app or also watching on YouTube. Thanks very much again, Pete.
No worries. Cheers, Alex.